The Girl with the Silver Eyes, Chapter 3b. Katy was so absorbed in the Scarlet Pimpernel that she forgot to watch the time. She had seen Mrs. M go out, carrying Lobo in a cardboard cat box, on their way to the veterinarian's. She was wearing a wine and pink and red flowered dress and carrying a gigantic white purse. And then Katy became so deeply immersed in the book. It's like you were drugged or something. You don't even know what's going on around you, Grandma Welker used to say, in annoyance about Katy's reading, that when the doorbell rang, she jumped a foot. Drat! She'd forgotten she'd promised Mrs. M to watch for Jackson Jones the paper boy, and she wanted to see his different colored eyes. Mrs. H., who had stayed in the kitchen reading A True Confessions all day, got up, but Katy beat her to the door. She saw guiltily that it was past 5, and she hadn't watched for the paper boy at all. She hadn't missed him, though. He did have one blue eye and one green one, although you probably wouldn't notice it right away unless you were looking for it. He was quite tall and skinny, and he stared at her uncertainly. "Is Mr. Redmond here?" "I'm collecting for the paper." "No, Mr. Redmond lives here," Katy told him. "My mother moved in a week ago." He said a word that Katy had once said and had had her mouth washed out with soap for it. "This is always happening to me," he said. "People move away without paying their bill. That's why I try to collect for most of them every week instead of by the month. There are so many cheats." "Did he owe you very much?" Katy asked in sympathy. $4.50, Jackson Jones said. She guessed he was 3 or 4 years older than she was, though it was hard to tell for sure. He was so tall and she was so small. "You people want to take the paper?" "I don't know. I'll ask my mom when she comes home. I can tell you the next time you come around." The boy sighed. "Oh, I'll probably come back around tomorrow. There's one guy in this building always makes me come back at least 3 or 4 times before he pays me, Mr. Pollard. He lives upstairs in 3A. "Oh, I've met him. He's a real jerk," Katy agreed. "He's not the only one on my route, but he's one of the worst. He used to say he didn't have the right change, and then when I started carrying some, he hadn't cashed a check, or he only had a $50 bill or something. Well, I'll check tomorrow and see if your mother wants the paper. Oh, I almost forgot." Katy dug into her pocket for the money the neighbor across the hall had given her. "This is from Mrs. Michaelmas. She had to take Lobo to the vet, and she asked me to pay you." He took the money and wrote out a receipt. "She's a nice old lady, Mrs. Michaelmas is. She lent me some books. There don't seem to be any other kids in the building to play with, so I'm glad to have something to read." "No, there's no other kids. I'm surprised they'll let you in here. People hate kids these days. They keep 'em out of most of the best places. Good thing we got our own house and don't have to rent, my pa says. We got 7 kids. Nobody'd rent to a family with 7 kids. Katy felt a surge of envy. "I don't have any brothers or sisters. Is it fun?" Jackson Jones stopped writing on his pad and stared at her in amazement. "Fun? To have 3 sisters and 3 brothers? You gotta be kidding." Katy knew Mrs. H. was standing where she could hear them, and she moved into the corridor and closed the door behind her before remembering that would make it lock and she didn't have a key. "What's it like then?" "Being in a big family? It's like a madhouse. We got 2 bathrooms, but you can hardly ever get into one of them. 2 of my sisters are 15 and 18, and it takes them an hour apiece just to get ready to go to school in the morning. And I have to share a room with my brother Wally. He's 17, and he's an absolute slob. He leaves his pop bottles and his apple cores around until they grow mold, and he always has the light on when I want it off, and the other way around. He borrows my socks and underwear because he forgets to put his in the hamper so they never get washed. And nobody ever gets an allowance because Pa says with 7 kids, it's all he can do to keep us fed, so everybody has to earn his own spending money. That's hard to do when people won't pay you after you've done the work. Here, this is Mrs. Michaelmas's receipt. I let hers go for a month if she wants to, because she never makes up excuses why she can't pay me. What's the matter with Lobo?" "He has a bladder infection." "Oh, well, I hope he's going to be okay. He's a good cat." Jackson Jones leaned forward to look at the new card Monica had inserted in the holder beside the door. "Your name's Welker?" Katy nodded. "I'm Katy. Mrs. M already told me your name, Jackson Jones. Do they call you Jack for short?" He nodded his head. Nope. Even my mother calls me Jackson Jones practically all the time. Jackson Jones, I told you to clean up the basement. Or, Jackson Jones, don't you dare put your feet on that clean bedspread. That kind of thing. Well, it's time old Pollard was coming home. Maybe if I catch him out on the sidewalk, he can't pretend he doesn't hear me ringing his bell. Good luck, Kitty said. And then she had to ring her own bell so that Mrs. H would let her in. No matter what Jackson Jones said, she'd bet it was more fun to be a member of a family than to be an only child. Maybe if you had brothers and sisters, they wouldn't think you were so peculiar. They didn't want anything to do with you. And at least there'd be people around, so it wouldn't be so lonely. She had left her book lying open in the chair, but she didn't immediately return to it. Instead, she walked to the little front balcony to see if Jackson Jones had any luck with Mr. P. Mr. P was there, all right. He'd just walked from the bus stop at the corner, and he was hot and perspiring. Katy heard Jackson's voice before she saw him as he came out the front door below. Hello, Mr. Pollard. Could I collect for the paper? You owe me for 2 weeks now. Not right now, kid. I'm in a hurry. I've got a date and I'm going to be late for it. Come back tomorrow, okay? He brushed past Jackson Jones, who stared after him in mingled anger and frustration. Katy couldn't see what happened, but she knew. She heard the front door slam in a sudden gust of wind. She used everything she could to build up the force of that wind, and Mr. P swore and stumbled backwards. If she craned her neck at the end of the balcony, she could see the top of his head, bald except for the strands of hair carefully combed across it. He was holding a hand to his face, and blood spurted over the hand and dripped onto the sidewalk. Gee, Jackson Jones said, You okay, Mr. Pollard? Did it break your nose? Mr. Pollard had to put down his briefcase to dig out a handkerchief, with which he staunched the bloody flow. He spoke indistinctly through the handkerchief. What made the door blow shut? There isn't even any wind. Just a freak guest, I guess. Listen, Mr. Pollard, everybody else has paid me, and it would really save me some time if you would give me the money now. If you don't want to wait for the receipt, I could put it in your mailbox. I told you, I'm in a hurry. Mr. Pollard bent to retrieve his briefcase and hurried inside, slamming the door behind him. Jackson Jones scowled after him and then glanced up and saw Katy on the balcony. See, I told you. He's a jerk, all right, Katy agreed. Jackson Jones got out of his bike and rode off down the street, and Katy went back into the apartment. From inside the front door, she could hear Mr. Pollard's feet pounding on the stairs. Opening the door a crack, she watched as he rounded the flight of stairs to the second floor and started up to the third. She wondered if his briefcase opened only with a key, or if it was one of those cheap ones that had little clasps. She thought she could manipulate those things so that the briefcase would pop open. She heard Mr. P start cursing before the cascade of papers came sliding down behind him down the stairs. Miss K was just coming up from the ground floor when he reached the second floor landing. Both of them saw Katy standing in her own doorway, and Mr. P gave her a look that was sheer hatred. Good heavens, Miss K said. What happened to your nose? The door blew shut on it, he said, sounding muffled as he bent over to scoop up his papers. And then the catch broke on my case. Here, let me help you. Miss K stooped to pick up the papers nearest to her. They looked as if they might be insurance policies. Does it hurt very much? It hurts like the devil. I don't suppose you could spare any ice, could you? So it won't swell so badly? Sure, I can let you have some ice. Miss K glanced toward Katy and smiled. Good, I'd appreciate it. Listen, are you busy tonight? For dinner? I don't know how this is going to look when I get it cleaned up, but if it's not too much of a mess, would you like to join me? I thought maybe that little Italian place over on 3rd Street. They were moving away from her up the stairs, and Katy didn't hear what Miss K said to that. But it had been a lie, what Mr. Pollard said to Jackson Jones. He wasn't in a hurry for a date at all. Mr. Pollard was an awful liar. He remembered the way he'd looked at her, as if he somehow knew she was responsible for both his bloody nose and his spilled briefcase. She wondered if Mr. P was dangerous.